Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we're really excited to bring you a great webinar today, 30 years of research on the non-breeding season ecology of warblers in Jamaica by Dr. Pete Marra. I am Lisa Sorensen, Executive Director of BirdsCaribbean. BirdsCaribbean is a nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving birds and nature in all of the islands of the Caribbean region through education, conservation, science, and action. And throughout the fall, we're celebrating World Migratory Bird Day. We've had a series of wonderful webinars, and we've also had an online campaign sharing a migratory bird of the day for the last 40 days or so. For each day, there's a natural history information on a migratory bird, online puzzles, coloring pages, and activities for kids, videos, bird calls, and more. So do go on our website and check it out. And if you're not familiar with us, please check out our website to learn more about us and follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Just search for BirdsCaribbean or Caribbean Birds. And I'd be happy to add you to our mailing list if you're not already on it to receive our monthly newsletter. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you have questions for Pete, please type them in the Q&A box or panel. And at the end of Pete's presentation, we will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of his talk. And also note for our Spanish speakers, we kindly have Adriana Tosas with us, and she's going to be doing closed caption translation. So look for this option in the toolbar on your Zoom screen. And if you're a Spanish speaker and would like to see this translation, then just click on the closed caption box and you should be able to see the translation. All right, so without further ado, we will introduce Pete. Dr. Pete Marra is the director of the Georgetown Environmental Initiative, Laudato Si professor in biology and the environment, and professor in the McCourt School of Public Policy. Pete comes to Georgetown University after a 20-year career at the Smithsonian Institution, most recently as director of the Migratory Birds Center. He has a PhD from Dartmouth College and has authored over 230 papers published in journals such as Science, Nature, and Conservation Biology on various aspects of the biology and conservation of birds and other animals, as well as on topics as broad as urban disease ecology. He co-edited the frequently cited book, Birds of Two Worlds, and recently published a second book called Cat Wars, The Devastating Consequences of a Cuddly Killer. Pete lives in Tacoma Park with his wife and 2 kids. He's an avid fisherman, a gardener, and a cook. So he will be speaking with us today. And Pete, we welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing your talk on 30 years of research on the non-breeding season ecology of warblers in Jamaica. Take it away, Pete.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me here. Let me just go ahead and share my screen and make sure this is all working correctly. Are we good?
Looks good.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody for taking time out today to listen to all the stories that we have from Jamaica, from all this research down there. I think the first time I stepped foot in Jamaican mangrove mud was in October of 1989. I was 26 years old. I had just come off a master's degree where I was working in Peru, in the really remote areas of Peru. I just done my master's at LSU, and I was beginning a job working for Dick Holmes, a professor at Dartmouth College who had been working on warblers up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And it was clear to Dick that if we really wanted to understand the warblers of New Hampshire, then he needed to do more than just work on the breeding grounds. He knew that he had to sort of start understanding what was going on in the non-breeding season. And not many people had done this before. A few had, but not many. And so I got a job working and managing his migratory bird research in Jamaica and also in New Hampshire in the White Mountains. So it was a dream job for a 26-year-old. I spent months and months and months in Jamaica at the time. All of a sudden, basically you blink and here we are over 30 years later. And in many ways, I still have never left the Jamaican mangroves or the wet limestone or the logwood scrub because I go back almost every year, or I certainly have students and postdocs that go back and have gone back every year since then. Throughout all my research in Jamaica and elsewhere, typically, my overarching question is to understand the factors that drive and sometimes threaten populations or population dynamics of birds. Why do sometimes their populations go down, and why do they sometimes go up, or why do they even stay stable? This is a fundamental biological question that also has really important conservation implications if there's a lot of species that are declining. So it's important from a conservation perspective to understand those sorts of things. So the way we're going to get there is kind of circuitous today, but my hope is that I'll be able to put the Jamaican research that I've been leading into a much larger context, a context that really demonstrates how important and influential this research has been over the years to the field of ornithology and zoology and ecology, because we've really been able to demonstrate the importance of something I'll call full annual cycle ecology, showing how critical it is to really understand not just what's going on during the breeding season, but also what's going on during the non-breeding season. And in doing that, we've also been able to demonstrate the critical connections, or how important it is to really understand how important it is to understand where birds that breed in or winter in Jamaica breed in North America. So understanding those population connections. This is something called migratory connectivity. And we've also been really influential in demonstrating that and the importance of that through our research in Jamaica, and that's expanded in so many other ways. So this small little plot in Jamaica, which is probably 50 hectares at most, this study site called the Fonthill Nature Preserve, has really spawned some really important ideas through all the students and postdocs and people that have been involved in this little bit of southwestern Jamaica. And I'm going to try to highlight some of these things for you today. Before I do, I want to also acknowledge the fact that there have been, as I mentioned, so many people involved in this research. This is none of the research that we do is just me at all. This is in so many ways a team project, a team effort. There's no single authored paper probably that's come out of any of this work. Richard Holmes, Dick Holmes, my boss, and then my advisor and friend, has really stimulated a lot of these ideas, but there's been many people since, graduate students and postdocs and friends that have been involved, and then local Jamaicans. Ann and Robert Sutton have been essential. Folks from NEPA, especially people like Yvette Strong that have helped get the research permits that we've needed. The Williams family, the Hawthorne family, and other folks, several Jamaicans that have been involved in the work. And then Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica, which owns the property. They've been incredibly generous in letting us work there year after year after year, and providing us with the permits that we've been able to get to do the work. But they've been very, very accommodating, and we're incredibly appreciative of that. So today I'm going to talk about these cycles, the importance of cycles in general, and how they really drive what we see in migratory birds, but also how it's not just about the cycles, but it's really working with the same individuals and populations throughout the year. So where do these birds in Jamaica go to really understand this full annual cycle ecology, something called migratory connectivity? So I'll start talking about that because it really does lay the important foundation for understanding a lot of this biology. And then I'll take us through the full annual cycle ecology of our star today, the American Redstart, and all we've learned by studying this species, these individuals, year after year after year, to demonstrate with data why you have to understand where these birds are, that it's not just about the breeding, it's also about the non-breeding, it's about migration, it's about what's going on in the wintering grounds. Then we'll talk about new tracking approaches that we're starting to use on birds to get at these even more important questions. And then I'll wrap up and sort of look forward to what we are starting to do and some of the things I think as a group that cares about the Caribbean and tropical birds, we need to start thinking about as well. So let's go ahead and start. And what I want to emphasize is the importance of cycles. When I was in graduate school doing my master's, I was taking an endocrinology course, the study of hormones. And it was there, I think, that I really started to appreciate how important cycles are, because they're so pervasive in everything we do, everything we see, in all physical and biological systems. The rotation of the tilted Earth on its own axis and around the sun drives light-dark cycles. They set our sleep and our wake patterns, as well as our annual cycles, such as our seasons that move us from spring to summer to fall to winter. And consequently, the behavior and the physiology of almost every living thing on the planet is driven by these cycles, whether it's the biochemistry or the hormones, or it's the cellular, or it's the animal, or it's the population of animals that responds, that move across the hemispheres in these either circadian rhythms or these annual cycles. Everything is built around these cycles. So I can't overemphasize this enough, because this really does form the basis for so much of the understanding the biology and the ecology. But what I'm going to argue today is that we have not been studying animals, especially migratory animals, in the context of their full annual cycles, let alone their full life cycles. So we're rewriting the textbooks as we continue to study these things in these ways. In 2015, we published a paper. I did an analysis with a bunch of postdocs to look at in amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals, when during the annual cycle has most research been done. So what I'm going to tell you here is that basically research has been biased towards the breeding season and then just single season ecological studies. So if you look at the bar A, it's breeding in transit or migration or stationary. And in general, across all 4 vertebrate taxa, the majority of research has been done during the breeding season. If you look in the middle graph at B, you can see that in general, most studies are done just during one portion of the annual cycle across all vertebrate taxa. And then have any studies considered what we call seasonal interactions? That is to say, when you're looking at an animal during, let's say, the breeding season, did they consider what that animal had been exposed to during the non-breeding season to influence its behavior or some other trait that you're measuring? And you can see here that the vast majority of studies didn't look at this at all either. So in general, research has not only been biased towards the breeding season, they haven't considered the full annual cycle, period. So I'll argue that we missed the boat on this from an ecological or even an evolutionary perspective. Why is there such a bias? Well, I think there's several reasons. I think it's logistically challenging to do studies throughout the annual cycle. It's expensive. The timing is challenging. Most research is done by academic institutions, and most of those academic institutions are located in temperate areas. So in North America or Europe, and they are in universities, they're in semesters. And so they are only available during the summer to do the research, and they're probably doing it during the breeding season because it's cheaper, it's easier, and that's where they've been encouraged to do. But it's more than that. They've also had this false impression. I've heard very famous ecologists say this, that everything outside the breeding area is unimportant. And this is something that is stuck into my head the first time I heard this. And I've sort of made it my life's work to prove that this is wrong. And I think we have. But it's not just that, it's also that we have a poor understanding of this phenomenon that we've termed migratory connectivity. And this is defined as the geographic and temporal linking of individuals or populations between different stages of the annual cycle, including breeding, migration, and winter. Or you could even have other periods in there, like the post-fledgling period or some other time frame. So if you look at the rose-breasted grosbeak in the top figure here, these are band recovery data. You can see these 3 different populations of rose-breasted grosbeaks that have been banned on the breeding grounds, and these are simply recoveries in Northern South America, Central America, and Mexico of where they were recovered. This is an example of migratory connectivity for the rose-breasted grosbeak. Why is this important? Well, I'm going to go through a couple of different examples of why this is important. The first is around understanding movement and doing conservation. And I'm not going to use a Caribbean species. This actually is a Caribbean species, the yellow-billed cuckoo, but we banded them and caught them in North America at 5 different locations. This is work by a postdoc of mine by the name of Callie Stanley. And we deployed the smallest satellite tags available on these birds. Yellow-billed cuckoos have been declining throughout their range. You can see all that red here. Western populations have all but disappeared. And Callie put these 5 2-gram satellite tags on 5 different populations, 2 in the West and 3 in the east, and we wanted to figure out where these birds were going. We didn't really have a good understanding of where these birds were going, and it's essential to understand where they go throughout the year to understand the threats that they face. And so let's look at the tracks that these birds had. These western birds are in red and orange, eastern birds in blue and green. And you can see just the temporal difference in the movement of these birds. The western ones came in later than the eastern ones. The eastern ones went right through the Caribbean, through Cuba, Jamaica even, and then Hispaniola. And there are definitely breeding populations of yellow-billed cuckoo in the Caribbean as well. Most of the tags stopped functioning in late winter, but a few kept going. We got partial migrations for some of these birds. But it's interesting because not only was the temporal pattern really interesting for those cuckoos, but so was identifying the wintering grounds for these very disparate populations on the breeding areas. This was in blue, this was what was considered the breeding area of the yellow-billed cuckoo before using NatureServe data. This is now what we think is the winter range of the cuckoo based upon our tracking data and also eBird data. It comes down to this small little area known as the Gran Chaco. The Gran Chaco is quite the interesting area, in fact, and I'll show you another figure in just a second. But if you look at the eastern birds are segregating to the north and primarily in Bolivia and parts of northern Paraguay. And the western birds all go to the south in northern Argentina. We can go in there a little bit deeper and look at remote sensing. And if you do, you see that Paraguay and actually the area in northern Argentina is totally being decimated due to soybean farming and also grazing for cattle. So this might be one of the things that's really explaining the decline of cuckoo populations in Western North America, not just the decline of riparian habitats. So knowing migratory connectivity, you can just see is critical to fundamental biology and conservation, just by understanding what's driving the movement, the rate of movement, the timing of the movement, where they're going and the threats that they're exposed to. We've seen this with Swainson's hawks and a variety of species. But until you do that, you really can't say much about what's causing the declines in those species. So understanding population dynamics is also a critical part of migratory connectivity. And this is what I'm going to focus on today with most of the research on Jamaica birds. This is a simplified diagram that illustrates the major components of the life cycle of any migratory bird. And in this case, it'll be a redstart. The red is the breeding grounds. You can see in a place like in the northeastern United States, redstarts might arrive on the breeding grounds sometime in May, and they're there. They're single brooded species, obligate single brooded species, so no double brooding. They're there until July, early July, and then they go through a molt in green and go through a migration, and then arrive on the breeding grounds in September and October, and it's there where they're there for the entire or most of the annual cycle. And the point I'm going to be trying to make here is that if we want to understand the fundamental biology, that what drives their survival, what drives their reproduction, what drives every aspect of their behavior, their natal dispersal, their range dynamics, then we need to understand these species throughout and these individuals throughout the annual cycle, such that whatever drives the variation in the number of young fledged may not just be due to things on the breeding grounds. It may be influenced by things during migration, spring migration prior to arriving there, or to things that have happened on the non-breeding grounds in the tropics, thousands of miles away. As obvious as that sounds, this is not something that had been studied very well prior to the work that we've embarked on in Jamaica. And the point I'm making is that the periods of the annual cycle are inextricably linked. They really can't be separated if you want to understand the biology. These are something we call seasonal interactions. They've been discussed in the literature actually for decades, but there just hasn't been a lot of data because we haven't been tracking them and people haven't recognized the importance of the non-breeding season. But Darwin actually talked about this a little bit. People like Fretwell and Lucas talked about it, but again, there hasn't been much data for this phenomenon. But seasonal interactions are simply, as I've described already, there's circumstances within one period or season of the annual cycle that influence events in a subsequent season of the annual cycle. And this is, again, I'll be talking about how we measure this, how we study this, how we quantify this. They occur at both the ecological level and the evolutionary level. At the ecological level, seasonal interactions can occur at the individual, and they can be in the form of something we call carryover effects. And these are non-fatal effects. So an individual might be in a poor habitat in the winter, and this might influence its total number of young that they fledge on the breeding grounds. So it's a non-fatal like effect. Or it can be at the population level in something we call a density dependent effect. So there's really high reproductive success on the breeding grounds, and there's a lot of young that are recruited into the non-breeding grounds, and that creates crowding. And that crowding creates all kinds of problems because they might be settling at a higher level than what the capacity of that habitat is in terms of food or predation or whatever it happens to be. So this is our star for the day, the American Redstart, and I sort of already basically explained this earlier, but they're on the breeding grounds. Males and females arrive on the breeding grounds. Males typically arrive before females. They'll start to display, sing, and then females arrive. Females choose the males, and they'll raise young. Usually in a place like New Hampshire, it'll be 4 eggs, sometimes 3, sometimes 5. And if they are successful in fledging those young, they will not breed again. They'll fledge their young and they will split and molt and depart on fall migration, which is more rapid than we used to think. It's about 1 to 2 months. And they'll arrive on the wintering grounds where they'll spend 5 to 7 months and then migrate back up north very fast, usually about a month, depending upon where they're going, back on the breeding grounds again. They're territorial on the breeding grounds, and they're territorial for the most part on the wintering grounds. And you can see the range here to the left or to the right of your screen using eBird data. The breeding range is quite extensive, all the way from the Atlantic provinces up to almost into Alaska, northern BC, into the west, out into Montana. They get actually all the way down into Louisiana. We've studied them in Louisiana, but you can see the dark red is where the majority of their range occurs. And they're throughout the Caribbean, primarily the Greater Antilles, but we've actually studied them in places like Trinidad and Tobago as well. Central America, usually the coasts, and into northern South America. So a fairly widely ranging species. They're pretty easy to study during the non-breeding period in a place like Jamaica because they consume only insect. I've never seen a redstart eat fruit. I'm sure they do occasionally, but they are pretty insectivorous. They're aerial insectivores in terms of chase. They'll glean, but they do a lot of aerial foraging as well. They flash their tail and startle insects. They'll forage on the ground. They'll forage in the trees. They do a whole suite of things. They're really a fun warbler to watch. On the wintering grounds, most males and females hold territories. Not all, but most do. If they don't all the time, they'll come back to these territories. So they show pretty high site faithfulness, both over the season and between years. So our birds come back to the same exact territory year after year after year. And we can easily age them as a young bird, hatch year, or SY bird, or an older bird, ASY, after second year or after hatch year bird. So that's really important to do if you want to understand the effects of an age or sex, male or female, on a particular trait that you're measuring. The work I'll be talking about is in Jamaica, no surprise there. And this work is primarily been done in the southwestern portion of Jamaica at a long-term study site that I've mentioned already, the Font Hill Nature Preserve. It's owned by the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica. It's considered a sanctuary. It's also called Luana or Luana Point. We've studied them all over Jamaica as well, not just in this study site here, but this is the location of our long-term studies. Now I'm going to put in 3 different trivia questions throughout the talk today. This is our first trivia question, just to try to make it a little interactive. And my question for you is, which island in the Caribbean has the most endemic bird species? Is it Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, or Trinidad? And Lisa put up the poll here, and you should be able to select here. I'll give you a few seconds to select. So which island in the Caribbean has the most endemic bird species? Is it Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, or Trinidad? Boy, nobody chose Trinidad. Surprising. Are you guys sure? Are we sure? All right, so 61% say Cuba. Interesting. 22% say Jamaica.
Hold on, let them finish voting, Pete, and then we'll share the results.
Okay, all right.
10 more people to vote. Come on, guys, get your votes in, get your guesses in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, here's the results.
Okay, so 57% say Cuba, 15% Hispaniola, 26% Jamaica, and 2% say Trinidad. Well, you're going to be surprised here, folks. Do I stop sharing, right?
Yep. Yep.
I did stop sharing. I'll just cancel the top there. The correct answer is Jamaica with 29 species. Now, I'm sure there's some folks out there that might challenge us on this. You can, if you like, but this is our best guess. I'm pretty sure it's Jamaica, 29 species. These are island endemics, so they can't occur on any other island. Cuba and Hispaniola are close in second place. Hispaniola is actually second at 28 and Cuba at 27. And Trinidad only has 2 endemic species. So you might find all that quite surprising. But Jamaica, I'm pretty sure, has the most endemic species out of any Caribbean island. So in Jamaica, back to our talk now. There'll be two other quizzes that I'll little polls that we'll have, trivia quizzes. We study the Jamaican redstarts in Jamaica in 2 primary habitats, but they occur in many different habitats. But we study them in the black mangrove and also in scrub habitat. And the Jamaican black mangrove habitat over that tropical dry season, as you go from January to February to March to April, gets pretty dry in March and April. In the scrub habitat, same thing happens, but the scrub habitat loses almost all of its leaves, whereas in the mangrove habitat, it at least stays moist because it maintains a lot of those leaves. So there's a differential in terms of the quality of that habitat and how it produces insects. So we've been studying redstarts across these 2 different habitats for all these years. And what we basically do is when we arrive, and we've arrived sometime in the falls, in some years, like in September, October, November, and some years, usually in the most recent years, it's been January and February. But we start capturing the birds because they're territorial, they respond to playbacks, and we can put up a mist net and play the song of a bird, and they'll come in saying, basically, who's in my territory? We catch them in the net. We band them with color bands and an aluminum band. We put color bands on them because we then spend a lot of time watching these birds over and over again. So they have unique combinations of color bands on their legs. And so we'll be able to recite these same birds. We also recapture these birds multiple times over the winter. So we can reweigh them or take a blood sample again to assess their condition in a variety of ways. And then starting in April 1st, we go back to their territories every 3 days to determine which birds have left for spring migration. And we've been doing this for 25 years or so now. We're now analyzing this long-term data of departure schedules. And then we recite and recapture in each year subsequently. So we get that annual survival. And we measure food, the insects, through sweep netting. So we also know the food availability on these territories year after year, over winter, et cetera. Now I'm just going to give you the answers. So what have we found over the years? Well, food availability in black mangrove over the winter period remains pretty high and stable. In second growth scrub, it declines. So that's that differential I was telling you about. Food availability really declines in that second growth scrub. The body condition of birds, regardless of whether or not you're male or you're female, or young or old, remains high and stable in the mangrove habitat, but it declines over the winter in the scrub habitat. Now, this isn't true in all years, but in most years, that's the case. And we've looked at body condition in lots of ways, just in total biomass that's lost. We've looked at stress hormones. We've looked at a whole suite of different things. And spring departure, same thing. It's early, regardless of sex and age, in the black mangrove, and it's late in the second growth scrub. Annual survival is high in the black mangrove, and it's low in the second growth scrub. So real differences in habitat quality. Performance really does depend on habitat occupancy, and it's not a sex or age thing. You're probably saying, well, Pete, maybe these birds are just better birds. And that's a good question. And so that's why we do experiments. And so we've done a variety of experiments to try to manipulate the system a little bit to really see if it is just the birds themselves, something intrinsic into the birds, or is it really a habitat effect? So with a former student, Colin Studds, we removed birds from the mangrove habitat and allowed these vacancies to occur so birds in scrub moved into those mangrove sites and compared their condition over the winter, their departure, their annual survival relative to birds in scrub. And it was exactly the same as I just described. Birds in mangrove relative to the birds in scrub had higher survival, better condition, and departed earlier, even though they started off in scrub. Nate Cooper, another former PhD student, now postdoc, we'll talk about some of his more recent work a little bit later. He did insect spraying and reduced the overall food availability, and he found the same exact thing. So we could change mangrove habitat to basically scrub type habitat in terms of food. And then a postdoc, Scott Wilson, did an irrigation experiment where he basically showed that when you add water in the late dry season, you get a lot of leaves and you get a lot of insects. He wasn't able to do it at the scale where we were able to get a bird effect, but it would have gotten there if we had enough water. It's difficult to find water in the dry season in the tropics. So we have demonstrated this basically experimentally as well as observationally. So those studies really emphasized spatial differences, how habitat varies, that habitats that vary in moisture and how this influences condition. Now let's think about how years of different rainfall influence performance, because we all know, anyone who spends time in the Caribbean, you've got dry years and you've got wet years. Lately, the past several years have been really dry, but our hypothesis was that performance also depends on annual winter rainfall. This is work that was from Colin Studds' dissertation, a previous PhD student of mine. On the x-axis, we have March rainfall. And on the y-axis, we have that insect biomass on these different sites. The red points are scrub habitat. The blue are mangrove. And basically what this says is that as you get more rainfall, you get more insects. There's always more insects in the mangrove than there is in the scrub, but water or rainfall in March is a really important determinant of that insect abundance. And not only that, here we've got March rainfall again and corrected body mass, which is basically the condition of birds, the average condition of birds in the mangrove and the average condition of birds in the scrub over winter. And if you're on the dotted line right here, that means your condition is constant over winter. If you're above it, that means your condition is increased or better than it should be. And if you're below it, that means your condition is worse than it should be. And in general, as you get more rainfall, your condition improves, whether you're in mangrove or you're in scrub. It's just that in scrub, your condition is usually poor, unless it was this one year when we had over 180 millimeters of rainfall in March. So rainfall in March drives insect abundance and it drives the condition of birds. It also influences when birds can depart on spring migration. So this is the condition on the x-axis, spring departure on the y-axis. Red is scrub, blue is mangrove. In general, if you're out here, that means your body mass is not where it should be. And over here, your body mass you're in good condition. In general, birds in mangrove are in good condition. So they're departing earlier and birds in scrub are departing later. So there's a real important linkage between rainfall, food availability, condition, and then departure on spring migration. And we've demonstrated that in a couple different times, a couple different ways. All right, it's time for our second pop quiz, our trivia question. It's not really a quiz, but it's a trivia question. How old do you think the oldest redstart has been recorded in Jamaica has been? So these are color banded birds that we've seen year after year after year. How many years in a row do you think we've seen one of these redstarts? Is it 4 years? Is it 25 years, 12 years, or 8 years? So if it's 4 years, that means that bird's made 8 round trips. 25 means it's made 25 or 50 round trips. 12 is 24 round trips. 8 is 16 round trips.
All right, the answers are coming in. I'll give you a few more seconds. Almost everybody has put their guess in. A few more people to answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and here are the results.
Very nice. Yep, that's a pretty good guess. The 12 is the correct answer. So 57 of you guessed correctly. And we've actually had 2 birds that have come back 12 years in a row, one male and one female. And they That means they made 24 round trips, which is pretty remarkable, back and forth to the breeding grounds. And you only get that information by doing these intense sorts of studies on colored banded birds. So up until now, I've really been focusing on the research in Jamaica. I haven't really put it into a full annual cycle context yet. So let's go ahead and ask that question. Does non-breeding habitat occupancy, so the condition these birds are in, the timing of their departure, does that influence their reproductive success back up on breeding grounds? And we haven't really been able to do this because we haven't been able to track birds. So when I was doing my dissertation, some work had started, this was back in the 1990s, work had just been starting on isotopes, carbon isotopes. These are elements in nature that vary slightly in weight. They're isotopic, so there's two variants of carbon isotopes, C3 and C4. And when you go from a dry habitat to a wet habitat, such as the scrub and the mangrove, you find that when you look at, say, the insects in these habitats, the insects in dry habitat tend to be enriched in delta C13, and the insects in the wet habitat tend to be depleted in delta C13. And this is because of a couple different reasons. The primary one, we think, is that in the dry habitats, the plants basically keep their stomates closed longer, so they retain the heavier molecules of carbon, whereas in the wet habitats, they keep their stomates open longer, and so they are actually releasing the larger or heavier molecules of carbon. And so when you actually look at the blood in the birds, the bird blood actually replicates what you'd predict from the insects or from the plants. So we did this, we looked at this first in Jamaica, and then I went to Honduras to sample redstarts there to replicate these same patterns. And what we found was that in wet lowland forest, in the black mangrove, and then in the second growth scrub, carbon isotopes, delta C13, became more and more positive or enriched as we sampled redstart blood or their claws or their feathers that were molted in the winter. So this is important because this means that because the isotopes are retained in the blood for 4 to 6 weeks, I can sample these redstarts as they arrive on the breeding grounds, the birds that arrive early versus the birds that arrive late, even though I don't necessarily know where they're coming from. And I can make a prediction that that bird arriving early, maybe it's coming from wet mangrove habitat or wet habitat, and that bird arriving late is coming from very dry habitat. And that's what's really driving the arrival dynamics on the breeding grounds, which we know is really important for driving reproductive success. So way back when, I actually sampled birds as they arrived at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, and that's exactly what I found at the time. Birds coming back early had signatures of birds coming from dry habitats, whereas birds coming back later had from wet habitats. I said that wrong. Birds coming back early came from habitats that were wet. Birds coming back later came from habitats that were dry. And we've had several students since then that have replicated these same results in multiple different locations, not just in the White Mountains, but in Maryland and in the Queen's University Biological Field Station in Canada, and other species have now replicated this same thing as well. This is important because then you can then track the reproductive success of these birds based upon the habitat they've originated in. And what Matt Rudink, a former student of mine, showed is that the total number of young fledged, most of that variation is explained by the habitat that bird spent the winter in. So if you're in a really wet habitat, you might fledge 3.6 young or more, but if you're in a really dry habitat, it's only about 2.7. And this is total offspring fledged, including those sired through extra pair paternity. And again, we've demonstrated this with multiple species now, including Kirtland's warblers and ovenbirds. And we've done it not just with isotopes, but we've done it with something called a light level geolocator, where we're tracking the same individual birds throughout the year. But these tags are archival. So we deploy them on the birds in the breeding grounds, let the birds go. We get their exact departure times, and we know exactly when they arrived. And we can actually show this graph here on the left for ovenbirds, non-breeding departure timing on the x-axis and breeding arrival on the y-axis. When birds depart the non-breeding grounds determines when they arrive on the breeding grounds, which is really important. And the isotope pattern mirrored that exact same thing. We showed this for ovenbirds and for Kirtland's warblers. So it's really, really important. So let's ask a slightly different question now about our Jamaican redstarts. Does annual survival differ between wet and dry years? Remember, those years differ depending upon rainfall. And does this vary with migration distance? Because our birds in Jamaica, our redstarts in Jamaica, are breeding at different latitudes, right? How do we know that? Well, we know that because we can actually use a different isotope called stable hydrogen isotopes. Deuterium is what it's called. And if you look at the deuterium map here on the left, this varies with rainfall, but as you go further north from the Gulf of Mexico, further north into Canada, you can see -45, -50, -55. These are different deuterium levels. And when a redstart finishes breeding at a particular latitude and molts in its feathers at that latitude, it incorporates this signature into its feathers. So in Jamaica, every year we pull the feathers, one single tail feather from that redstart, and we store it. And I can run that feather in something called a mass spectrometer, and I can estimate the deuterium level and then pin that bird to a latitude where it bred the previous summer. Hope that makes sense, because this is a really cool technique that allows me to then study my redstarts in Jamaica based upon the latitude that they bred at the previous year. Doesn't tell me anything about longitude, so east to west. I don't know anything about that. All I know is north to south. So the feathers sampled on the non-breeding grounds in a place like Jamaica reflects the origins from the previous summer. It's pretty amazing. And we can then look at their annual survival from winter to winter in Jamaica and look at that survival after wet years compared to the latitude they breed at, which is based upon that feather I sampled. So that's on the x-axis, and their survival. And after wet years, you can see that their survivorship is pretty constant across their entire breeding latitude. But after dry years, this changes dramatically. After dry years, if you're breeding further north, that means you're migrating much further, you have much lower survival than birds that are breeding further south. So there's a migration cost after dry years. And remember, after dry years, birds are stressed. They are in poorer condition, they're leaving later. The same birds leave later in dry years compared to wet years. And there's a cost to migration. This is a pretty phenomenal pattern. It's also suggesting that the northern range limits of birds are not just determined by things that are happening on the breeding grounds, they're also determined by things that are happening in places like Jamaica in the tropics. So they're truly inextricably linked. And most of you that live in the Greater Antilles also know that there's been a long-term drought in the Caribbean. It's been going on for 15 years or more, 20 years, and it's likely to continue for another 20 or 25 years. And so we asked this question because there's been this long-term drought, not every year, but because it's been this pattern of long-term drought. And because that means that northern migrants are probably not doing as well, has the population in Jamaica changed in terms of their mean breeding ground origin? And because I've sampled these feathers year after year and I've saved these feathers, I can ask that question. And in general, it does mean that. The natal origin of Jamaican redstarts, the breeding ground origin, has changed. So back in 1990, they were further north. And now in 2015 and 2016 and 17 now, they're actually further south. The mean breeding latitude of my Jamaican population has changed. Now, if we were to plot this on a graph, you can see that it's shifted from around here down to here. I just think this is really fascinating. And it also suggests to me that we've been spending so much time thinking about climate change from a temperature perspective on the breeding grounds. And it probably is influenced significantly by precipitation that's going on in the winter as well. And it requires looking at both ends of the spectrum in a full annual cycle perspective, as I've been telling you, in order to really understand it. But it also drives home this point about these northern range limits of birds are in part controlled by things happening in places like Jamaica. So I've just now focused really on the redstart story, but we've also been banding birds in general in Jamaica. We had a long-term mist netting study for 10 years to look at how survival of migrant and resident species vary with rainfall and temperature. And these are just new results. We haven't published this yet. And what we show, and I wanted to show some of the real basic results here, is that migrant, so in the x-axis is the Southern Oscillation Index towards the origin, -1.5, -1.0. Those are wet years. Out here, 1.0, 1.5, those are dry years. And in general, the survivorship, the annual survival on the y-axis of migrants and residents declines in dry years. And it appears as though residents get harder hit than migrants, but there's a lot of overlap here in terms of our confidence interval. So it's too early to say, but migrants and residents are impacted by wet versus dry years in the Caribbean. Interesting, temperature, and this again, they're preliminary, temperature is also having an interesting effect. So temperature on the x-axis, annual survival on the y-axis. And as it gets warmer, both migrants and residents tend to do better. This is temperature in March, and this is rainfall in March, by the way. But we still need to dig into these results a little bit more, but there's some interesting patterns here with climate, both precipitation and temperature, and what the consequences are for residents and migrants. And these results vary depending upon the species. You can see for species like prairie warbler and worm-eating warbler, these are all precipitation on the x-axis. As it gets wetter and wetter, their annual survival tends to go up, redstarts as well. Ovenbirds, it's in the opposite pattern, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. And for residents like bananaquit and loggerhead kingbird, and to some degree, yellow-shouldered grassquit, survivorship goes up, annual survivorship goes up with precipitation. But for a species like white chin thrush, it looks like it goes down. But again, lots of variation there, lots of uncertainty around those values. So to summarize this part of the talk, I hope I've convinced you that we cannot study birds or any animal during just one period of the annual cycle and hope to understand the variation that drives their biology. Seasonal interactions drive so much of these basic biological processes. We have to understand these species throughout their full annual cycle to truly appreciate these things, their biology, things like migration schedules, their reproductive success, even their breeding season range limits appear to be driven in part by things happening in the tropics, not just by things on the breeding grounds. So a full annual cycle perspective is essential. And to get that, we need better information on migratory connectivity. So you need to be understanding and studying the same individuals or the same populations throughout the year. Stable isotopes, while they were very, very informative and they're fun to some degree, tracking individuals is really so much more satisfying. So I'm going to show you what we've been doing for the last several years. This is work with a current PhD student, Bryant Dossman, and also Alicia Bruner. This was a redstart that we attached a light level geolocator to the back of, and it turns out redstarts and Swainson's warblers that Alicia worked on, and also ovenbirds do really, really well with light level geolocators. And so these are tags that have a light sensor on the back, a stalk, and a clock, and they record sunrise, sunset, and also the time of day. They do this throughout the year. You put it on the back of the bird, you let it go. Then you've got to capture the bird the next year and download the data. And you can tell roughly where that bird had been. And these are data that Bryant Dossman plotted. And it turns out our redstarts that we thought were going to the northeastern United States, guess where these little suckers are actually going? They're actually going to the upper Midwest in places like Wisconsin and Iowa, which is really surprising. But it's into a concentrated area. So now we're gearing up to do some more direct studies of redstarts on the breeding grounds in those areas, because that looks like the place where our Jamaican redstarts are going. Bryant has also started to automate a lot of our work in Jamaica using MODIS towers. You can see here a picture of this tower here, and we can put these very small tags in the back of these birds, and they transmit not to an antenna or a satellite, but to an antenna on the ground. And we've got these 5 antennas on our study sites in Jamaica, and he can track the movements of these birds throughout the winter, but also look at things like their departure date, because we get pings like every few minutes on these birds throughout the day, 24/7. So we can look at when American redstarts depart in an automated way. We don't have to track them every 3 days anymore. Ovenbird, Swainson's warblers. We can look at the exact time of day that they leave. And for the most part, most of these birds are leaving about an hour after sunset in April or May, which is pretty remarkable that we can actually quantify that. And we can also, because there's so many towers that are showing up in other places in the United States, we get pings from our various species in different places. And so we can look at things like the rate of migration. which you can see here. So redstarts versus ovenbirds versus Swainson's warblers have different speeds at which they migrate. And this is new data that Bryant is now collecting based upon this new technology that we're now deploying on our birds in Jamaica. All right, it's time now for our final trivia quiz. What US endangered species was recently seen in Jamaica for the first time? Was it a piping plover? Was it a Kirtland's warbler? Was it a California condor or a northern Parula warbler? All right, let's see. Everyone get their
Okay, answers are coming in. 69% have voted. A few more people. I'm voting for the condor, Pete.
Oh, it's good. Yeah, we need a couple people to vote for condor. I think that's wishful thinking.
That would be so cool. All right, 5 more seconds. Everybody get your votes in. And we shall share the results.
Great. All right. Well, if you guessed Kirtland's warbler, you're correct. Alicia Bruner, a very savvy bird watcher, saw one near the net and managed to get it into the net and actually catch it. And we took a picture of it. And it's actually, this paper was just accepted at the Wilson Journal of Ornithology just recently. And so that's the first record of Kirtland's warbler in Jamaica. It's pretty cool. And it's a good sign because their populations are expanding and they're probably going to be showing up in more surprising places. And I'll use that as an opportunity to talk briefly about something we're doing with Kirtland's warbler, because I work not just in Jamaica, but we also work in the Bahamas. This is work with Nate Cooper, a former PhD student and postdoc and now research associate. But because Kirtland's warblers have such a restricted range in the Bahamas and also in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, we can use this same technology with these antennas and put Modus tags on the backs of Kirtland's warblers in places like Cat Island in the Bahamas and track these individuals and then pick them up because we have an array on the breeding grounds and study the same individual birds throughout the year. This is a pretty powerful technique. We've been doing this for several years now. And we think we can do this with redstarts now as well. So we're going to be doing this in a full annual cycle way with redstarts and with Kirtland's warblers to really understand the same individuals and the same populations throughout the year. And I guarantee we'll be uncovering some pretty cool biology of these species in the future. But in addition to that, I didn't talk about this, but I was also an author on the recent paper that came out in Science last fall on the decline of 3 billion birds. And a lot of what we're also doing is spending our time thinking about how to reimagine conservation of birds, because it's not working. If it were working, we wouldn't continue to be seeing this massive decline of species. So we're taking a different approach to this and re-looking at it from the on-the-ground conservation work that's being done to the science that's needed and the gaps that are there to the policies that are protecting these species. And that includes in the Caribbean, looking at resident species, Caribbean endemic and species of conservation concern. And I've long thought about the importance of establishing some sort of a monitoring program for many of these Caribbean endemics to make sure that, if there's all of a sudden a big perturbation, whether it's a disease or it's a hurricane, that we know what's going on with these, incredible species. But it also means the conservation of high priority habitats. The Caribbean, just like so many other parts of the world, is under enormous stress. And these coastal areas, because of the beautiful beaches, because people flock there for tourism and the dollars that brings in, there's enormous pressures to convert so many of these habitats into beach resorts and other sorts of areas. We need to make sure we're putting a lot of pressure and emphasizing conservation of these high priority mangrove areas and other coastal areas, as well as some of the gorgeous tall forested and wet limestone areas in the Caribbean. So I think we really need to spend a lot of time thinking about those sorts of habitats moving forward in the Caribbean. So that's all I've got to say. Hopefully that made sense, and I'd gladly take some questions.
Excellent, Pete. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm sure you have a lot more that you could share with us, but that was a great overview of some of your main results over the years. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you do have questions for Pete, do please put them in the Q&A panel and we'll let Pete, I'll pose them to Pete and he can answer them. So we do have one question here, Pete. Songbirds generally molt twice a year, but on your annual cycle graph for the American Redstart, you only showed the post-breeding molt. Is that because we don't know much about their molt on the wintering grounds before they migrate north?
So actually, New World songbirds primarily molt once a year. They go through a full body molt once a year. It's post-breeding. They go through a partial body molt. They don't molt their wing feathers or tail feathers. Most of them don't. There are a few that do, but most of them actually do not go through a full body molt or full flight feather molt pre-breeding. Species like dick thistle do, but most of these warblers do not. In the old world, they do, but in the New World, they don't.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. Let's see, Catherine asks, what are the risks to the bird regarding attachment of the tracking device?
So there's definitely some risk there, but there's been quite a bit of work that's looked at what percentage of the body size can these birds carry. So we know that it's usually around 3 to 4% of the body size. So we try to keep it below that amount or around that amount. Sometimes we'll go to 5%. And we'll put it on the bird, we'll watch the bird, and we'll make sure that it's not impacting their behavior at all. And in the case of redstarts and ovenbirds and Swainson's warblers, we've been studying them. We study them all throughout the winter. So we actually watch them. They're color banded. We spend a lot of time studying them. So we know that the survival of ones carrying the tags is the same as the ones not carrying the tags that just have color bands. So even though there's probably some impact, it's minimal. And the amount of information we gain is tremendous.
Great. All right, another question for you. Could the deuterium levels be altering in North America, confounding that data?
That's an excellent question. I think the question is there any evidence that the deuterium levels have changed over time? And no, not over that time frame. It probably has not. My understanding, according to biogeochemists, the deuterium levels do not change over such short time frames, but that is an excellent question. Somebody was paying attention.
Yes. All right, and Gail Coffey asked, did you study where ovenbirds and other species in Jamaica breed? Do they go to the same area as American redstarts, Midwest instead of the Northeast?
No, the ovenbirds are actually going to the Northeast, like Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut. They're primarily going in that area.
Okay, Andrea comments, excellent talk. Which indicators of habitat quality you recommend in winter habitats if it's difficult to obtain and off free captures to access to body condition? Cheers from Columbia.
Hi, Columbia. In general, I think any intact habitat, any natural habitat is probably worthwhile saving. But I think the taller the forest, the better in general. But I think that there's some really important native scrub habitats as well. I don't want to give the impression that scrub habitat isn't important for some species. It really is. These habitats in Jamaica are dominated by a non-native tree called logwood. It's logwood scrub. But there are a lot of really important birds that also breed in those habitats, like yellow-shouldered grassquits and a whole suite of, there's several hummingbird species. So you need to really kind of understand what species are perhaps more threatened than others and which ones depend on those habitats. One of the big take-home messages from my research that we've done is that not all habitats are created equal for migrants. And this was a big thing that people were saying, that migrants are generalists and they can occupy all habitats equally. And in fact, that's not the case. The fact that redstarts don't do well in scrub and they do well in mangrove suggests that habitat occupancy, the fact that the bird is there, doesn't mean it's doing well. And so that's a really important message.
Yeah, that is interesting and very important, because you might assume, well, the bird's here, this must be good habitat, but that's not really the case.
Yeah, and redstarts occupy a whole range of habitats. It doesn't mean they're all doing well, but by looking at sex and age patterns, that can tell you a lot.
Yeah, very, very important result. Okay, Wendy Lee, hi in Jamaica.
Hi, Wendy.
She asks, do you have any study sites on the north coast of Jamaica? She's got a beautiful one right near her that I'm sure she'd love to entice you to.
And I'd love to be there right now. We've looked on the north coast several times in the cockpits, and just too many ticks. No, I'm just kidding. We got a lot of ticks, plenty of grass lice in the south coast too. We don't. It was easier to focus on with these intense sort of studies in the South. We've definitely gone on the cockpits periodically and also up towards Q Park in the center part of the island and done work with black-footed blues and redstarts for different questions that we've asked.
All right, and Damian White, hello from Jamaica. Good day, Pete. In Jamaica, we are currently losing a lot of mangroves. That's true for all of the Caribbean, actually. He asks, are you saying that mangrove habitats are very important for migrant warblers?
Yes, 100%. And they're important for so many reasons, not just for migrant warblers, but for resident species, for buffering against hurricanes, for nurseries, for reef fish. I mean, mangrove habitats are just so incredibly important. The habitat that I'm in Jamaica is probably one of the few examples of this beautiful relic, old growth black mangrove habitat. And thankfully, you know, the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica has protected it, but we've gone through several different episodes of where they've threatened to sell that whole area off. And I've found myself in Jamaica working with people at like the Jamaican National Trust and other groups to save that one site that's there. And so we need to protect, identify all these sorts of really important mangrove habitats that remain because they're disappearing really, really rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're fighting it all over the region. And I think that's true that mangroves are important habitat for warblers in all Caribbean countries.
Yeah.
Okay, and Ricardo, hi Ricardo. He says, this is not a question, but since you mentioned yellow-billed cuckoos early in your presentation, I wanted to point out that this fall migration has been an eruption year for this species in Jamaica. We've literally seen hundreds in single locations in the past few weeks. Did you hear about that?
I did hear about that. Yeah, by all
really
means.
cool.
Yeah, I keep my finger on the Jamaican pulse as much as I can, even though I'm not there. And I did see that people in Kingston with several cuckoos in their backyard, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, honestly. If it's because they're stressed or what the deal is, but I thought that was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, pretty cool. They were stopping over. We were wondering if it was weather related, that they get pushed by one of the hurricanes that were nearby.
They do go through Jamaica. I mean, I've had them in my sites in Jamaica over the years, but this year that was just remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, literally hundreds of them on a road. Rooster's World, Damien was showing videos and stuff, which was really cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, it shows you the importance of stopover locations too for these birds. You know, they stopped, you know, they must have needed to take a break and rest and eat before continuing on southwards.
Yeah, because after they hit Jamaica, it's a long way before they get to South America.
Right. Okay, Ann Sutton asks, is it possible that birds wintering primarily in dry forests come to wet areas, mangroves, to fatten up when the wet forest birds leave early?
Hi, Ann. Yes, it is possible, and they do it. And so when birds start to leave the mangrove, we do see scrub birds start to move in a little bit, and then they go back. And some of the work that Bryant Dossman is actually doing with this automated MODIS telemetry is showing us that these birds are not as territorial as we thought they were necessarily. Some are, but some birds, when the conditions get really, really poor in the scrub habitat, some of these birds are going off on these weird forays, and they're going into mangrove habitat, or they're moving over much larger spatial areas, and then they come back into the territories, but they'll go and they'll feed a little bit in the mangrove and then come back. And so there's a lot more cheating going on than we expected. But yeah, they're definitely going into the mangrove, fattening up, and then leaving later when it comes to the migration period.
Oh, that's neat. Okay, and Alina asks, is this data being used to conserve these habitats in Jamaica?
Not directly. I wouldn't even know how to, you know, we talk about these data a lot. I've met with in the past various ministers to talk about these data. I present at NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Agency. They're aware of these data. And so at any point in time when people want these data, they are more than available. If anyone has any ideas for how these data could be more useful for land use planners or for administrators, I'm all ears. We would love to make these data incredibly available.
Yeah, we'd be happy to help you with that, try to get the word out just to general audiences in Jamaica and around the region. Definitely going to have you do a blog article for us soon, Pete. And
sure.
That message out. It all helps. Articles, press releases, that kind of thing. All right. Samuel asked, what method to generate body condition would you recommend for migratory birds on the wintering ground?
So I would recommend capture, recapture. So capturing a bird once and then trying to recapture it after some sort of a period of time to look at just body mass change. Just get yourself a digital scale and that weighs to the nearest tenth of a gram and just look at mass change. Or you can just look at, there are ways, we have a paper coming out that talks about this. The muscle mass, the shape of the muscle, the pectoral muscle, actually goes from being convex to concave as these birds start to lose protein. And you can actually just come up with an index to look at that as well. And you can do both of those things if you don't have a scale.
Okay, we have a few more questions. I hope you can hang on, Pete.
I'm good. No, whatever.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, we have lots of excellent questions, so I hope to get to all of them. Somebody asked, in other non-breeding regions, there are individuals that don't have territories, maybe related to habitat quality. How do we study these individuals or infer the effects of habitat on this portfolio of the population?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are lots of species that show different spacing systems. And it doesn't mean that there could be dominance hierarchies or there could be different years that impact those individuals. And I think, the capture recapture approach is ideal, but if you can't do that, then birds for their body size should be a certain body mass. So you can actually, if you get good measurements on a bird of their wing length or their tarsus length or their tail length, given the overall population of birds for that structural size, they should weigh a certain amount. So you can, and I showed some data for this today, given the weight of a bird, just like, if you're 6 feet tall, you should be a certain body mass if you're in ideal condition. You might be too heavy or you might be too light. Unfortunately, I'm usually too heavy. But if you're a bird, you should be in a certain spot. And so you can actually do that with a bird with a single capture. And as long as you get really good morphological measures.
Mm-hmm.
It gets more complicated, but you can do it.
Right. And it reminds me also of being able to possibly estimate body weight without even capturing the bird. I'm thinking of like Craig Packer studying lions in Africa. He was able to just visually make estimates of how fat a lion was. And I'm thinking of seeing arriving shorebirds. For example, Mark Yokoyama in St. Martin showed a whimbrel that had just arrived in October.
Yeah.
It was just skin and bones. You could just see its keel sticking out. And then, but when they're ready to migrate in the fall or spring, they're like flying footballs. So you can even see this without capturing them, which is kind of cool.
Doing that with a redstart or a Tennessee warbler, even for a yellow-billed cuckoo, I think that'd be hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wish.
Yeah, I know. Okay, Robert Lockett says, you've commented that early arrival on breeding grounds results in more successful breeding. Why?
Because those birds get the best territories. They usually pair up with the best. It's usually the best females with the best males, because they're both coming from the best habitat, so they're in the best condition. And because they're in the best territories, they're getting the best insects, and they also have the most time to nest. And so in case they fail, they have more time to re-nest. And so all those things combined influence their overall success.
Okay. Yeah, and here's a comment by James. The study by Cooper, 2015, spraying insecticide. How unfortunate. Aren't the results going to be obvious? Talk about unnecessarily causing stress. Any comments?
Well, in all these cases, none of these results are actually obvious. And we reduced the overall insect abundance on just a few territories to what the natural decline would be in a dry year. And it immediately, they come back. These insects are generated really rapidly. It's like add water and you get insects. And the insecticide we use dissipates really rapidly. We used a very non-harmful insecticide. So in science, it sometimes requires you to do certain things in a few areas, a very small area, so you're not having an impact on populations. You might be having a subtle or short-term impact on individuals, but the results from those papers can be really important for future understanding of what drives these relationships. So I would do it again.
Okay, thanks for that insight. Kennedy asks, an interesting issue is that American redstarts are also common in fairly urban gardens in Jamaica. Is there any differences in their migration patterns?
So I've seen them plenty of times in gardens. I've seen them in latrines. I've seen them in dumps. They go where insects are. And I haven't actually studied ones in urban suburban areas directly. I had a PhD student that looked at migrants in Mandeville and in areas near bauxite and that sort of just pattern relationships, but not looking at migration or any of these other sorts of questions. So I don't know.
Cool. Well, keep an eye out for leg bands on your birds and let us know
That's right.
if you see any.
Yeah.
Let's see. Gail Woon asked, should mangroves be planted to give birds better habitats? We will be planting mangroves in a few weeks in Grand Bahama Island.
Yes, mangroves should be planted, and there's lots of efforts to plant mangroves in various places all over the world. I've been in mangrove farms throughout the Caribbean, South America, Saudi Arabia. There are lots of efforts to plant mangroves, and I think that's a wonderful thing to do and to encourage school groups to do. There's all sorts of really interesting projects for restoring mangroves, and they're fairly simple forests to restore. And it has such a huge impact, not just on that terrestrial habitat, but again, as I was saying earlier, the marine environment as well. So it's an awesome project to undertake.
Absolutely. Yep. We're encouraging that all over the region too, especially post-hurricane areas. Okay, and Benoit, who's with the Canadian Wildlife Service, says, MODIS, did you say you had 5 stations in Jamaica? We are trying to increase MODIS coverage in the Caribbean, so I'd be interested in learning about their location. I don't see them on the MODIS website.
They should be on the MODIS website. We don't leave them up throughout the year. The antennas are there, but we take down the receivers. But they're typically there from January till May, and they should be on the MODIS website.
All right.
Yeah.
Pam Hunt. Hi, Pam. She says,
Pam.
FYI, record numbers of yellow-billed cuckoos in New England this summer. Just a comment.
Yeah.
Damani Calder. Hi, Damani. We get many redstarts and other warblers in our urban areas. With expansive urbanization, are there any recommendations for improving these areas to make them better for migrants or for birds in general?
You know, it's a really good question. And I think that we don't know enough about the production of insects off of a lot of these ornamental trees. My gut on that, and we've studied this in the Washington, D.C. area, how non-native plants versus native plants provide insects for birds. And so when we know that when you have more than 30% non-native trees and shrubs in your yard, it turns an area from a source to a sink. That means an area stops producing, and chickadees in those areas stop producing enough young to maintain their populations. I don't know of many studies in the tropics that have looked at how different tree species act for producing insects, because there's lots of insects that depend on these plants for producing their larvae. And birds feed off those larvae, and those are the nursery grounds for birds. So it'd be a wonderful study to look at how these different species, ornamental, native, non-native, produce insects. And that would be what I would look to for recommendations for what people would plant in their yards, so they're actually living in a bird-friendly way in places like the Caribbean. Be a really interesting study.
Yeah, we have a lot of good information on that. Bird-friendly plants, native plants, and we have an ebook on that on our website. So look for that on our website, Heritage Plants, and it will give you some tips on native plants that are known to be good for birds to plant in your yard.
That have information on the insects that are produced by those plants?
No, we don't have that information, but just generally, you know, they are fruit producing or they provide good shade or cover, nectar for birds. It would be great to do that study that you're talking about. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
Yeah. All right, and Ricardo comments, it's been an uphill battle to sell the idea that migratory birds are our own. Everyone thinks they are foreign birds and hence not our priority. E.g. hunters often use this misguided approach to lobby for duck hunting season. This info is important in showing just how important wintering grounds are, but how do you suggest we try to get this info across?
I mean, I've spent my entire life trying to get this information across in all sorts of ways, not just in the scientific literature, but by doing videos, by doing, promoting it in the press. I'm contemplating a popular book on this topic on full annual cycles and the importance of the tropics. I mean, as I showed you, and I didn't show all the examples of where the fundamental biology of these migratory birds that we share between the tropics, a place like Jamaica and North America, is determined by what happens in the tropics, like range limits. Most people never even occurred to them that range limits would be set by things in the tropics. Climate change. There had just been several different papers that on climate change and the projected impacts on birds in the US and Canada didn't even consider things happening in the tropics. And I would argue that 75% of what's going to happen to those birds is determined by things in places like the Caribbean. Has nothing to do, or maybe the habitat's important to some degree, but if they're not surviving the winter in the right condition, and that's going to be determined by precipitation, we're wasting our time.
Yeah.
It's essential to think about it from that full annual cycle perspective.
Yeah, and I think we have to work even harder at getting that message out, Pete. And
I think it's going to change. It's huge. It's really important.
It's huge. We got to do better. And we have a media working group, and we can make this a discussion of our next meeting. And anybody that's on this call that wants to join us to help us think about more ways that we can get this message out to communities and decision makers in Jamaica and the Caribbean. We would love your help and input on that.
Well, let me just comment on that. Yeah. One of the most frustrating things to me is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is important. It's no question it's important, but it is only an act that is shared between Canada, the US, and Mexico, Japan, and Russia. There are so many other countries, obviously, that are not party to the MBTA. Yeah. So we need to use other mechanisms, either create them or re-equip them, like the Western Hemisphere Convention. So it involves more countries around the conservation of birds. Yeah. And I'm hoping that given our 3 billion birds paper, we can use this as an opportunity to try to address those sorts of issues and to try to get things like the Western Hemisphere Convention back on the table and put teeth around it.
That sounds great. Yeah, let's work on it. Okay, if you don't mind, a couple more questions.
I'm here, I'm good.
Yep. And this is such an interesting discussion. Somebody asked, what separates the mangrove birds from the scrub birds? Is it that other birds claim the mangrove first, and do some birds fight for a place in the mangrove?
A great question. So this was something I studied for my dissertation. I looked at the arrival dynamics. I got to Jamaica in August and was there until probably November for 2 years and quantified the arrival timing of birds. And in general, in that time of year, it's the rainy season. And so birds would settle randomly. And older birds didn't rush back. Younger birds settled randomly. And as older birds came back, they're coming back to their territories, they would basically kick out the younger birds. And if an older bird didn't come back, the older bird or the younger bird would be able to occupy that habitat. And as the dry season settled in, there'd still be movement around and birds kicking birds out of the mangrove, and they'd be pushed into the scrub. But it is all about dominance. And in general, the mangrove habitat, I didn't talk about this yet, is dominated by males, and the scrub habitat is dominated by females. It's something called sexual habitat segregation. And it's a really interesting pattern.
Great, thanks for that. Damien asks, Pete, will you be continuing your work in Jamaica, or do you have a student that will be taking over the program?
Yes and yes. All this work that's been done in recent years has been because of really talented students and postdocs that are doing the work. And so Bryant Dossman and Alicia Bruner have been the last couple students there. Bryant's working his stuff up. I think he's going to continue with the postdoc. I've got a new student, Henry Stevens. I'm always looking for students from the Caribbean that are interested in migratory birds to do work. And so the hope is to continue the work in Jamaica. This year, it's going to be a little challenging because of COVID. We had to leave early last year. We were only there for about a month last year before we had to leave. So we're hoping to get there this year, but I don't know if it's going to be possible. But yeah, the plan is to continue. I have no plans on quitting.
Yeah, this long-term data is so valuable.
Yeah, it's probably one of the longest studies in the tropics of migratory birds.
Incredible. Okay, and Ricardo says the 2 American redstarts that survived to 12 years, were they wet habitat birds in Jamaica? Did you track them to a specific region in the US where they bred? And how does that relate to your theories of how far north they migrate?
They were in mangrove habitat. Both of them were in mangrove habitat. And I don't know, I never went back to, I'm sure we have their deuterium estimates, but I didn't go back to look at where those birds specifically were. I'd have to do that.
Okay, cool. Presumably they were super fit individuals and just the best habitat was wherever they were.
Yeah.
And Liz asks, how is competition for food among the different warblers affecting their food intake? Does the redstart do better than others, like palms, northern parallels, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are interspecific effects between these warblers. So we haven't looked at interspecific competition between redstarts and other migratory warblers. And we've studied ovenbirds, we've studied prairie warblers, we've studied black and white warblers. We have a paper coming out on black and white warblers in Jamaica. It's coming out in the new journal Ornithology in January. We've studied ovenbirds, Swainson's warblers, a bunch of them. We see no evidence of interspecific interaction necessarily between those. However, we have studied interspecific interactions between redstarts and resident yellow warblers. And we actually have a paper coming out on that in one of the next, maybe it was just in the most recent Ecology. And so we do see interactions and consequences of interactions between yellow warblers and redstarts in mangrove habitat. So there is evidence for that, but that's it. That's all we've seen. See no other evidence across other species, but I'm not sure we've looked for it as carefully as we probably need to.
Okay, interesting. Liz asked, what about partnerships with University of the West Indies and Mona in Jamaica?
So we have, early on, we worked a little bit with Peter Vogel, and we've had students like Leo Douglas and Hurlitz Davis that have done undergrads there, and there have been interns that have been from UWI. There have been some other biologists there that we worked with, primarily crocodile biologists that have come down to our sites and done work on crocodiles. And so we have had some partnerships there, mainly with field assistants, but a couple students. Justin Saunders is another student from Kingston who has worked with us quite a bit, not just in Jamaica, but also in Bahamas and also in Michigan. But we're always looking for Jamaican assistance or assistance from anywhere in the Caribbean.
Right.
And grad students.
Yeah, definitely need to be training more students. Send them to Pete if you guys know anybody.
Yeah, and my email, by the way, is peter.marra, M-A-R-R-A, @georgetown.edu.
Great. Thank you, Pete. Okay, I think there's one last question and then we'll end this. Anders asks, what revolutionary discovery do you anticipate about the Kirtland's warbler?
Well, we just published a paper on the Kirtland's warbler that we think was quite surprising. So these are birds that we had tagged. I didn't show these data. These are birds this is Nate Cooper and myself that published this in Current Biology in July or August. We put MODIS tags on a bunch of Kirtlands in the Bahamas, and we tracked them back up to the breeding grounds, and we found them on the ground, and we tracked the reproductive success. And when birds started to have their young hatch, some birds that weren't paired up, all of a sudden started to do these big movements, and they moved at night. And if they failed nesting, they would move. They moved up to 70 kilometers in the middle of the breeding season to these different patches. So we basically discovered, because of MODIS and automated radiotelemetry, all these new secretive movements that birds were doing, a good proportion of them that we didn't know they were doing, only because we were able to watch them 24/7. So it was quite surprising. That was really remarkable. But because we're going to be tracking birds throughout the year and using the same individuals, I think there's all sorts of things that we're going to start to be able to understand about what controls the biology, as opposed to what we're trying to do with stable isotopes without looking at the same individuals.
Okay, Pete,
That's just an example.
That's great, Pete. Can you repeat your email one more time?
Peter.marra, M-A-R-R-A, 2 R's, @georgetown.edu.
All right, super.
If you just Google me, Peter Marra at Georgetown, you can get to my website. It's Marra Lab, M-A-R-R-A Lab. One word, you can get there too.
Okay. All right. Well, super. Thank you so much, Pete. This was amazing. It was really great to hear an overview of all your work, and then the discussion afterwards was really fun and fascinating. So thank you so much for your time to share with us. This has been really great way to celebrate World Migratory Bird Day, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. And thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll see you next week. We have a really great talk next week. I hope you've seen that. It's called Killer Fashion by Jen Yerkes from St. Martin. And she'll be talking about how the the plume industry at the turn of the century, making hats for ladies and so forth, how that decimated the bird population for a while, but then there was this awareness and comeback that really launched the modern conservation movement. So that's going to be a really, really fun talk next Thursday at 3 p.m. And at 4:30, we have a talk by Alex Sansom. She's with the, she'll be giving that through the Trinidad and Tobago Field Naturalist Club. And we sent out an email on that as well. And that's posted on our Facebook and Twitter. So look for that if you can join that at 4:30. And we'll be posting this talk on our YouTube channel within a few days as well. And you should be able to see it on Facebook. I think we launched it a little bit late, but it's there as well. So thanks again, Pete, and everybody. Take care, stay safe, and we'll stay in touch.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Yep. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.